Spielbutton. Hallo Freunde, es ist 10 Uhr in Redmond und willkommen zurück zu .NET API Review. Yeah, can you tell when I picked my language today? We have about a half a screen of 10 and almost a full screen of future. And I don't know, maybe we'll get through all the 10 issues today. First up, we have a blocking issue, because we always do. Add initialize control of device DPI to control for early initialization. This is WinForms 13550. Take it away, Klaus.
Thank you. So we have in WinForms to deal with an architecture that is old. And the problem that we have in some areas is because of the way that controls get set up when we wrap around them in Win32. We need a way to set flags before the actual constructor code of an inherited control runs. So what I mean by that is we have this hierarchy of controls. It's starting with component, then control, then let's say a button base, then we have a button, and then we have checkbox and so on. And so when the checkbox, for example, wants to say, hey, I'm not owner drawing, I want to wrap the native Win32 control, that it needs to set up flags or need to do some other initialization. And setting those things in the constructor in certain cases is just too late already. And the reason is that the base control, like control in that case, is calling an overload, create params from its constructor already, which means that create params, which is also a virtual method, runs first because when the constructor runs of the checkbox, then the checkbox calls first the constructor of its like parent child and so on until it reaches control, and then control's constructor is calling create params, which means that create params effectively, if it's overwritten in checkbox, runs before the constructor has run, and that leads now with high DPI settings and with dark mode settings to a couple of problems where we think that it's not a good thing to put code for initialization into create params because it just doesn't belong there, and it would be a nightmare for people to find it. So we already had an internal method for setting up the device API in those cases, and we also feel that third-party control vendors need to do the setup for high DPI stuff also, as we do it internally in those early overload or early code virtual methods. And that's why we want to have a very early way to, name it in a way that is discoverable, and we know where to put the things before they actually create the control. That's the motivation behind it.
So the idea seems fine. I'm slightly concerned. Your previous internal method was initialize for DPI, and so it took the DPI, and this one takes the DPI, but it's just called initialize. So should it be initialize DPI, or should it
No,
take
because
something more complicated than just an int in the set so that you can expand it in the future? Because like if you need to add another one in the future, now you'll have initialize and initialize earlier. So I'm just wondering about it
I
expandability.
mean, we could I mean, we would be able. The only thing I could possibly imagine is that we would need at one point a float for the but no, the DPI cannot be a fraction. No, I wouldn't be
No, I
able
don't mean
to
for changing the notion
think
of
of
what
it.
DPI is, but I mean like when WinForms was, or before anybody had variable DPI, you would be like width, height, and position is all you need, and then it's like, well, now width, height, and position and DPI is what you need, and so what's the thing that's going to be added to initialize in 5 years that we wish this took a custom class or struct so that we could just add a property onto it?
But I mean, the thing is that originally this didn't even have a parameter or an argument to pass, and I I just thought that this was a good opportunity to just like merge those two methods together, because I think the naming that we had internally, this initialized constants for initial DPI, is also well, unfortunate. Let's put it that way. It sounds a little bit weird, and the purpose was just merging that one and make it public with then providing a public way to early initialize the control, and so that you can, for example, opt out of dark mode if you don't want your control to be themed by the base classes. Then you can use initialize control in that case to just opt out. But that's by setting a flag. The only thing that, because it's so early, the only thing that you wouldn't be able to really retrieve by yourself is the device DPI at that point, and that's why we're passing it. I mean, the thing is, you can pretty much access at that point, because the constructor have not ran from the inherited controls. You can pretty much access everything of the controls infrastructure anyway, and the reason for that is that that the property bags of every control in WinForms is set up, or is done, or is held by a static property bag, which gets initialized as soon as the static constructor runs. That has also historical reasons, and so, but the device DPI is the only parameter that we really need to pass, because it's like past that early concept, and the rest, if you want to deal with it, like the defaults and everything, you can already access, because they're of static nature and they have initialized at the time. So I cannot think of anything that we would need in the future to pass in addition to that, if that makes sense.
I think so.
So I discussed it with Jeremy, and he was concerned about the like, we don't have state usually at that point, or enough state to make it like secure, but I would agree, but then the static nature of all the property. Oh, sorry, my Alexa was it's just it's just a different approach.
Fair enough. Anybody else have other questions or comments?
Do you have to recreate the control if the TPI changes? Sorry, I was just curious. Not something that I've done here.
Just from a naming perspective, I joined a little late. I apologize that this was already covered, but initialize control doesn't say anything about when it's being called, yet its value seems to be that it's super early on, like from the constructor before anything else is configured. do we need something about that in the name to make it clear that this isn't like post-construction, this is during construction, early, whatever?
I think so. I picked the name initialize control because we have also the very commonly known initialize component that is called from the constructor. So I think the relation of the names between initialize component, which we generate in the designer, which is placed in the constructor from every derived form, and initialize control are so similar that I think that intuitively I would say that the connection is already there. But I want to make sure that I talk to Andy, and we definitely will have to, add the documentation and just point out what are the scenarios around this method. So what scenarios is this method targeting, which is like things like high DPI, or if you want to early, indicate that you want to wrap your control by Win32 differently because you have to set up the flags before create params is called, which is also called by the constructor of the base control, namely control, but later than initialize control. And so it fits into the existing architecture of how a form, for example, is set up. So initialize component, it is for the form which we generate, and so I thought initialize control would be, from the naming perspective, the most intuitive things to do.
It's reasonable if there's prior art within WinForms. And again, sorry if you already covered this, but if the goal here is to, I guess I'm unclear of the ordering of things with regards to other virtuals, but in the process here, the control constructor is going to get a device DPI from somewhere, and that's what it's using to call initialize control, and your goal is to do that before other virtuals are called.
Yes.
Why can't the derived control just override those other virtuals and access some protected int device DPI there?
So for once that it is create params, that is and that is a property that is a virtual method that gets called more or less first from the constructor of control. And it being a property that gets overwritten is kind of awkward to set up initializations. And also I have a big issue with discoverability that I have to tell customers, hey, if you want to set up the things for create params, you have to override create params before you call the base method, the base property practically, and then you are calling like create params the base property. So for the safe flow or safe control flow then to run for once, and then I couldn't even overload create params with the device DPI if I wanted, but at least not for C#. I could do it for Visual Basic because Visual Basic properties can get parameters, but not the method.
So just make sure I'm understanding. You're saying it's not that they can't do it today. It's a usability thing that you're trying to help with.
Yes, but we also had an internal method that is initialize constant for initial DPI, which we are phasing out with it and replacing it, and also that one ran before create params. So we're merging, because this is something that third parties also need to have, and you would probably need to run this code before. So theoretically, we could do it in create params, but it would just I'm not even sure if it would work if we did everything in create params.
So I'm looking at initialize constants for initial DPI just to try to understand it. And I noticed that, like, currently, does everything just throw out the parameter? Like, why do none of the built-in controls like checkbox or radio button like need to use the parameter?
Well, it's only some controls that need the DPI in an early stage, and whenever we are wrapping right from the beginning, and the controller is set up to wrap Win32 APIs right from the beginning, then we need to know it at an early stage. And but it's not true for every control. It depends on if you're wrapping or not. And sometimes, so that was also my problem with the buttons, for example. So when I implemented the button renderers for dark mode, then the problem is, if you take a look at the button base, then you will see that there's an owner draw method or property. I think it's an owner draw property. And this owner draw property is also called from the base constructor. Again, the owner draw property ultimately determines if the control is going to be wrapped around the Win32 control, or if we as WinForms are responsible to render it completely ourselves. And since this is also done from the constructor, again, the setting up of owner draw would then be, you would be just knowing that you at what point you wanted to call it. I mean, in this case, I'm not even sure if create params would be early enough, but initialize control would be early enough. So those things are really difficult to know, let alone discover then, if you run in such like constructs. And for that reason, it's just the safer way to do, and the more straightforward, streamlined way to discover that, and override it at the place where it's been safe and you're set up at a point where your control gets initialized the way you want it, really. And as I said, create params is a property and it's not a method. So we can't pass a parameter to, we can't overload create params.
No, but it could access a base property.
It could, but we would, you would have problems to set it correctly at that point, right? I mean,
You don't have to set it. The control would if the control has the value of device DPI in order to pass it into initialized control, then it has the value in order to set it on a property before create params is invoked.
Right, and that's what I think our methods are doing, right? Because they have access to the internal field, which is why they don't need to use the parameter.
They have only access to those fields that have been set at that point by control, but not by the other base classes, right?
Right, but you're passing in device DPI, which has been set as an internal field in control at this point.
So Stefan's point is that I'm going through the 6 cases of or 5 cases of overrides for initialized constants, and 0 of them use the parameter. I think that's the point that Stefan's trying to make.
Right, because they have access to the property, which is the point you're trying to make, right? We could just make the property public, right? Like, it is weird because it's called in the constructor, but this is all weird because we're calling a virtual method in the constructor.
So, but what is when like a control in the middle of the hierarchy is setting something up for device DPI, and then you inherited it. At that point, you wouldn't have the device DPI and the derived control, would you? Because it would be, the call would be coming from control, but the constructor in the middle control might have.
I guess I'm not understanding that, Klaus. Are you saying that the value of device DPI changes in the control, in the invocation of initialized control in the hierarchy?
It can. In PMV2 scenarios, if the control has not been parroted yet and you drag it on the other screen, for example, then the actual DPI might have changed or might
But
not.
by
have
that point,
been
initialized
activated yet.
control has already been called.
Well, yeah, but I mean, yeah, I'm just afraid about scenarios where you have, a form. Let's say you have a form where you have a tab control, and then inside of the tab control in another tab, you have a series of controls which never have shown yet. So, but yeah, I'm not sure if the constructor would have run at that point. Probably it had.
I mean, if you have the object, it has.
Unless you pass this to something else in the constructor, right? But probably not.
I'm
But
I'm
even
just-
if you pass this in the constructor, if it's in your derived constructor, your derived constructor is only invoked after the base constructor has been.
I see.
Yeah.
We're talking about the base. Okay.
so my concern is
Oh, actually, that's
If
not
you
quite
have-
true, but yeah, okay.
if you
Sorry,
have
that's-
control and then you have button base and then you have button, and so when button base is overwriting initialized control with a certain device DPI for whatever reason is different than that of control, and control is running, then control would pass, let's say, the standard value, the default value for device DPI, to button, while button base constructor would only run after that.
I don't understand. If button derives from button,
Yeah,
button base derives from control.
yeah,
Control's constructor is the one calling initialize control with a value of 1, 2, 3 as the argument.
yeah.
So button base's initialized control override is going to see 1, 2, 3. Are you saying that button base changes the 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5, 6 when it calls buttons initialized control? I
No,
don't
but-
understand how it's
so
the base.
when-
It's the base class that's doing the invocation here.
Yeah, that's correct. But I mean, the device DPI is set in a way, right? I mean, it is just passed. So the argument was, wouldn't create params be enough to then actually access the device DPI that would be provided as a property, and the property needs a backing field. The backing field, as long as it's set by control, it is okay.
Yes.
But if the value is set by some other instance, then it's not okay, because it would not propagate early enough to create params, because that, create params of control would directly call the overload before any other instance would have been set up correctly.
I think we're talking past each other, so let me try it a different way. The controls constructor is calling initialize control,
Yeah.
right, in this proposal. To do
Yeah.
that, it would have already had to have computed device DPI.
Yeah.
When it computes device DPI, it could store it into a read-only field, read-only property, whatever,
Yeah.
which would be available since initialize control is being invoked before anything in the derived class, including the derived class's constructor. Those constructors would also be able to see that read-only field or read-only property correctly constructed.
Yes.
So any constructor in the derived class would have access to the exact same value that was being passed into initialized control.
Yeah.
Further, if that value were to later change, it would be changing after the value that was passed into initialized control. So it would be wrong in either case. So I'm trying to understand why control just setting a property is insufficient.
So let's say, so what would happen, let's say if the backing field for the DPI would be a protected field.
Okay.
And the button base class, so let's say the hierarchy is control, button, base, button.
Okay.
And the button base class would overwrite the DPI of that protected field
By setting it.
by setting it. It would do so in its constructor, which is the natural thing to do. Wouldn't it need to do it in create params then to provide the value early enough? Because if I then in the derived button control would access the protected field, it would not have been set yet because the constructor of button base would not have called yet.
Button base's constructor runs before button's constructor.
That's true, but create params of button, since it's been called by the control class or by base class, and it's overwritten, would be run first. So create params of the control
Yes.
would run. That means buttons create params would run. Then the constructor of button base would run. It would set the high DPI value. Then the constructor of button would run,
Right.
and then
What?
everything would be too late. And that is my concern.
So why is button base setting the field?
Well, that's the problem. Maybe not necessarily with that, but that is exactly what is happening, for example, with the owner draw construct that we had, or what we have, and it's just the existing architecture of what we're dealing with. It's unfortunate. I mean, after all, it's a part of Java originally, and I think it has a series of reasons why it happened. One of those may be that every method in Java, if I remember correctly, is virtual. But if you then access a virtual method before the constructor chain had run, the Java compiler would warn, which makes it obvious, but the C# compiler does not do it. So maybe that was one reason that they felt safe to do that architecture. And the other thing is that most of the properties have backing fields which are based on static constructors. So if you take a look, I mean, this is something in that particular case that we could also do for the device DPI to mitigate that problem, to like put it into a kind of a property bag in the same way. But then I'm afraid that for the sake of discoverability and because it's so unusual, the whole thing, the existing thing, that that this is just the more intuitive, discoverable way to make sure that people really hit the right spot to do the initialization.
So I just want to make sure what you're saying is going to happen. So button base is going to override initialized control. It's going to be passed the device DPI of 1,000, and it's going to in turn initialize something. It's going to in turn initialize button based on a DPI of 500. Like a different DPI than was passed in.
Yeah. I don't know why. Maybe that is not, yeah.
But it can't call
And
up
how
that
is
way.
it going to? How is it going to invoke? If button wants to know the DPI, how is button getting the DPI?
I mean, in that case, because it's overwritten twice, initialize control would be called from the base class of control, would change the DPI, and then would call the actual class, and that would get, in that case, the right DPI from the
That I'm not
from the
understanding.
view of the
So,
from the
but button base and button both override initialize control.
Yeah.
Button base wants to change the value that's provided to base's initialize control. How does it do that?
Wait, Claus, did you understand the question? Because like I'm just curious. You said earlier, sorry if I'm just filling the dead air, but because I'm a little confused. Like I see lines 14 through 16 on the screen, and for me, I honestly don't completely understand why you'd want to change the initial DPI of the base class from what the caller wanted. And it sounded like you said you didn't know why either. But yeah, sorry, Tobe, you were waiting on an answer.
Both why would you want to, but how do you even do that? Like, I don't understand the mechanics of how you do that. If button base and button both override initialize control, how does button base cause button's initialize control to be invoked with a different value?
I think that is a good point. Yes. Basically, that would also not work in the existing setup that we have internally. Then, and I didn't really think about that. I merged the two cases, but I never thought about this case, which was already there, but only internally. The only thing that I
but internally, the argument is being ignored entirely. In all the overrides, they're all being ignored.
It's true, but I mean, yeah, it's what we had there.
I guess, Mike, here's my concern. You know this space better than any of us, but effectively making public an internal method that is obviously not doing what it was supposed to do feels like the wrong decision.
That is true. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So my initial proposal was, when we discussed it, was just to introduce initialized control without the device DPI and leave the other method like that. The problem is that I picked the other method because it already existed internally, and we had questions about, can we be, from third parties, can we participate in getting those calls? So could you make this method publicly? I didn't really look into the method, into what the motivation to rewrite that internally really was. Maybe I should have done that more and questioning why it was there and for what reason. So with that in mind, I said, well, I don't see any harm in making that public because we already have it. But yeah, I have to agree that that scenario would then, if like a middle level control would change the value, would not work, but it would also not work internally. Still, I think even if we, not passing the device DPI, what is your opinion with a general approach to have initialized control? Or would you still say, well, then you have to do the setup in create params?
I mean, I think it's gonna. I would need to look at the flow of stuff. My default answer would typically be if we already have a virtual member that you can already override to achieve it, what you need to achieve, adding another virtual that you have to override doesn't seem like a significant benefit. I mean, we're talking about override create params, do whatever setup you need, and then return base.create params. Or is it, if it's void, just base.create params. If there's significant benefit, I don't object to having another virtual that gets invoked, even earlier in the creation cycle. You have to have docs that very clearly spell out the order of invocation of these virtuals. But I do object or do have concerns with if we're if its purpose was to pass in device DPI and device DPI isn't exposed in some fashion, then we need to figure out how to expose it. If that wasn't a purpose and someone just needs a hook, then I don't understand the purpose of a hook other than create params. Like, I guess I don't know what's being achieved. Why internally did we need this when it was called? Why is initialized constants for initial DPI needed when create params already exists?
So
what is it that it achieves?
So the thing is that is a good question, and I honestly don't have a good answer for it because I know that that was ongoing layout work, which was done, like 3 years ago, and I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, the problem is really
let me try. Is create params called a lot just to get the creation params? And so putting initialization logic there is weird. Is that the answer?
Well, create params is so the whole history of this method, actually, of this API introduction, was that for the whole dark mode, where I used to put the flags that set the style for dark mode, we had an internal review, and then we discussed it and said, well, the approach to do that, to set that up in create params feels just wrong because it doesn't belong there. And then I said, but the problem is that there's not a good way to put it anywhere else, because in the constructor we cannot put it because it's too late. And from that discussion, we said, well, the actual right thing to do would then, have a clear separation of concerns, so to say, and said we would rather have then a dedicated method where it would be called, because the constructor is just too late. I mean, honestly, we all thought that, having a virtual method called from the constructor was already something. And then adding another one just to mitigate that one. But given the fact that the architecture was like that, we said maybe it's the lesser evil of to introduce that method than having people trying in the constructor and not immediately understand why it doesn't work. So that's the history of why this API came into existence. So, and then I saw that when I refactored control, that we also had this method that we called, and I said, wow, that name is not very fortunate. And then I thought, but I cannot change it because it is there, until I saw that it was like a private protected, so like internal. And I said, well, I can change it. Well, I can change the name. Well, I cannot only change the name, I could even address what a couple of vendors asked me, namely to, could we participate in that? And that was my motivation to actually, merge these two separate things together. Maybe I should have, looked more into what this actually method does, but then, yeah.
So here's my opinion, and I'm open for others to weigh in. I would suggest seeing whether you could just delete the internal initialize constants, whatever it's called, and just put it into each of these controls, create params override. If you can, that both gets rid of that weird oddity and confirms that it's not necessary. If you can't, that's, it'd be good to understand why, how, and from that perspective, understand what derived controls are going to want to do with this thing. And then, we introduce something else because there's obviously a gap that can't be achieved. That would be my preference. But at the end of the day, there's only a handful of folks that are ever going to care about this. So it's probably not worth a whole lot more time. But it does feel very strange to me.
But I can just say, yeah, I can change that. So I can change the passing of the DPI.
No, I meant get rid of the method entirely and do whatever initialization those things are doing in initialize constants. Do it without that private protected virtual.
Yeah. The question is, what would you do? Would you still be in favor to have the initialize control method?
I'm saying try without it. The only benefit, the benefit that's been highlighted is that it basically is initialized control necessary, or is it possible to do without it? The argument I'm making is it seems like it should be possible to do without it. And if you can do without it, then the only benefit is one of usability.
Mm-hmm.
And is it really worth from a usability perspective? Like, let's understand what that usability looks like for the handful of folks that derive from control.
Oh, it's not a handful of folks that derive from control, really not. I mean, we were really surprised by how many people are really, inheriting text box, for example, to
and those folks need to change. Those folks need to change things before the constructor has finished.
Yeah, the problem is really that if you control with the flags or set up initialization with flags that need to run in the constructor of control, then yes.
Sure, but I'm suggesting that out of all the Windows Forms developers in the world, there is 0.1% that need to derive from control. I'm making up a number, but I'd argue that's of that. You tell me if I'm wrong, but that it's around that. And then of that, waving my hand 0.1%, 0.1% of those care about things happening before the constructor has finished. And it's that percentage, whether it's large or small, that we're talking about. And for everyone else who's deriving from control, adding even more virtuals is more surface area they need to understand. So there has to be real benefit to doing it. And I'm trying to understand what that benefit is.
So so first of all, yes, doing the things in create param is absolutely possible. That was that was my original implementation from dark mode. I didn't really like it, but it worked. And then we had the discussion in our internal review, and we felt that from a discoverability point, where people who derive from a control and want their own control to opt out of dark mode because they will implement the dark mode handling themselves because they use a paint, it would be beneficial for them to have like an easy discoverable method where they can put this flag settings when they
So
know
what
it's
does
not
that
working.
code look like? Do you have an example of someone implementing that code with your proposal?
Yeah, I mean, not in the proposal, but I can show you. I can show you. So could you find button base, the button base code?
Done.
So if you take a look at button base and please scroll down a bit so that we see the constructor. There is a, in line 79, there's a set style in the constructor that calls a property owner draw. And if you, just, click on owner draw to go to owner draw, then you will see that owner draw is pretty much now something that asks a property to set up something. Now the problem is when you go to create params, you also have if you could find it, the call to owner draw where the actual thing is like put together. So if it is owner draw, so in other words, if the flat style is set, then those things are all constructed inside of button base. Now the problem is if you wanted to opt out of owner draw at that point by setting respective flags, you would have to know to do that in create params, because indirectly it's ending up everything is set up to be done in create params, but you wouldn't even see it here from button base, because you would just need to know that the base constructor would first call create params, then it would be call the create params in button base. A button base constructor would call owner draw again, and then that would then determine if the button control would be wrapped in a Win32 control or actually be owner drawn.
But control dot in what was the name of this method? Initialize control. That will be called before the button based constructor is called. So any setup that does is get to disable whatever owner draw is going to be re-enabled as soon as button based constructor runs.
Not really, because it's done with flags and you just orig or ending the flags.
Right. So if your initialize whatever override disabled it and then button base's thing re-enables it, how does that help you?
I mean, yeah, but it depends on if you're setting it up before or after you call the base constructor.
But button base is doing it after the base constructor is called. So after initialize control is called.
Yeah, but it's the same problem with create params. You just have to know when
sure,
to.
But I don't understand. But
right. So why not just leave create params? Yeah, no. So I mean, I'm kind of with Tobe here in that, like, I'm not a Windows Form developer, so huge grain of salt. But I see like 20 some overrides of create params and like 5 of this initialized components for initial TPI. If they could be combined, if you're doing this like weird kind of thing of like, Well, you need to know when the base class calls this in the constructor to know when you can set which fields and when they'll be read and yada yada. If like less of those, right? Like there's already one of those. Can we just keep it as one of those? Like there should, and like, you know, maybe this is conventional in Windows Forms, but like if people have already been doing things this way, you know, large language models know how to do things this way, etc. Like why have more ways?
But yeah. So as I said, my original implementation of the dark mode was exactly like that, because yes, I know it for years and I did it like that. It just, you know, we tried to make it more accessible, and we thought of, can we make it more accessible? And that was the primary motivation. I mean, I'm not dying if you all said, well, you know what, then let's leave it like that. And yeah, it's unfortunate that create params isn't the first choice to people, you know, for people finding that the initialization has to, you know, first go into a property, and secondly, before the base of that property is called. But yes, I mean, yeah, as I said, it was like, it was a result of an internal review that where we said, no, we probably have to do something about that. I mean, you can gladly look into the history of the dark mode PRs and see that that was my initial approach, and it just didn't get through. So I'm fine with it. Yeah, I mean, if that's if that is if you don't see the benefit, then I can relate to that too. I mean, yeah, for the people who really know how to, what the historical quirks of WinForms are, this 0.1%, I mean, let it be 1%, but it's certainly not more than that. I agree absolutely with Steven. I mean, it's not like half of the WinForms developers are touching ever create params or, you know, like this internal stuff. Then it's also okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds to me like there's already the pattern of override the getter for create params, and the functionality that someone would care for in initialize control is you just put it before the call to base, and then if you want to extend your base class behavior, you put it after the call to base, and it's not great, but it exists. So unless we're saying that the new method, after we've already removed the device DPI, if it's about improving a discoverability, which I don't think I've heard, then it sounds like there's no need for it.
Okay.
If the need can be articulated, then sure. But I think that Steve has called into question the why, and I'm not sure that any of us like the answers, including you. So.
No, it's fine. I mean, as I said, this was my original approach, and I'm here because of the result of the review meetings. And I also didn't the architecture of WinForms itself. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old.
Fair enough. All right, I'm gonna give this a final disposition of closed, but of course, if there's more information to bring it back, then you can certainly do so.
No, I don't think there will.
Fair enough. Thank you, Klaus. I closed way too much stuff. Oh well. I think that was next. Yep. Enumerable.range. Again, I think. Mr. Tobe.
Yeah, so we approved this one, but I had some concerns when actually looking at how to implement it because it seems either super hard or impossible depending on how you approach it. Um, from a generic math perspective, so the semantics of enumerable.range as it currently exists today in like the int based one is it does overflow checking for start plus count. When you have start as a t and count as an int, we lack a good way to do that quote quote correctly. And so the PR that was opened had some corner cases that weren't really accounting for things. If you scroll to the bottom, where I have a comment, right there. I think there are a few options for what we could choose to do. One would be to just say, you know what, we're just going to close this issue. If you really need a range for t, you do .select after the range. Another would be to change count from int to t. The upside of that is you're only ever working with t's, and you can represent counts that are larger than int if you really wanted to. The downside, there are I think two main downsides. One is for small t's, you can't represent certain ranges. So like if I was using s byte and my start was -128, if int was a count, I could have 255 or something and expressed from -128 to 127, or I'm probably off by one there, but you get the idea. If count is t, then the maximum count with s byte could only be 127, and so you couldn't represent that whole span, that whole range. A third option would be to just do away with the overflow validation and say we're just going to do, for I equals 0, I is less than count, I plus plus yield return start plus plus. And so basically let it start overflow if it needs to overflow. So I could do start I could have t be byte and count be 1,000, and we'd iterate from 0 to 255 and then 0 to 255 and then 0 to 255 and so on until we yielded 1,000 items. I don't know why enumerable.range does the overflow detection that it does. I think there's probably pros and cons, but if we did that and we didn't change the existing enumerable.range with int, then we'd have a difference in behavior whether you were doing enumerable.range or enumerable range of int, which is weird. If we change the enumerable.range today, we could, as a quote non-breaking change, we could remove that overflow detection from the existing non-generic enumerable.range, but then we have a non-trivial behavioral difference between enumerable.range in .NET 10 and previous versions in what I think is a fairly prominent API. And so if folks started relying on that, I think we'd see some behavioral issues when you then started running on older versions. So that's also a little weird. So this is basically, what do we want to do with this previously approved API?
So you said your concern. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Stefan.
All right. So is the concern that if we don't check the overflow, that in like .NET framework, people will run net standard code and it will when they didn't expect? Like, is that like the only downside of removing the
removing the constraint from the existing one? I think so.
Okay. That was it.
Yeah, so my thoughts here are that removing the overflow is the better long-term behavior, especially if we ever want to have something like create sequence where you can provide your own stepping amount that's non-one, or if you want to support floating point, things that we had discussed previously. And we had discussed some of the issues that could come up, like floating point incrementing by 1. You can only do that 16.7 million times for a float before it starts returning the same value. I think if we didn't have the overflow and count just represented how many times you're going to perform an increment operation and return that value regardless of what it is, would be sensible. Something we could do to avoid breaking or changing the existing behavior and make it clear there's a difference is we could call it range unchecked. We already have checked variants of some APIs explicitly to indicate that they do overflow. Unchecked is the inverse. It's not the prettiest name, but it would make it clear that overflow or other T-specific behavior is possible. I do like the idea of it being possible to have more than 2.14 billion items in a range for scenarios that need it. I don't know if making that T is the sensible way to do that, because you've got all the issues with, you can have 256 valid values for something that is byte or S byte, for example, but also you don't necessarily want users to be able to say max value of a UINT 128 because that's never going to finish. Realistically, long is already itself too big to complete in any of our lifetimes. But int is too small, so I think if we had something like range unchecked and considered some long count overload in the future, it would cover both scenarios.
So,
And Tanner, just make sure I understand. So your opinion would be to change the name of this and not change the behavior of the existing int-based method. Is that correct?
The main proposal is to just go with changing the behavior, and then as an add-on, if we believe that the behavioral change is too big, a suggested fix for that would be to just call this range unchecked instead.
I see.
But I'm not sure that it's worth a different name when we're trying to get more and more people on .NET, modern .NET anyways, and the number of people who would hit the edge case for int in particular is likely not huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I vote against. Like, it's an interesting proposal, but I'd rather avoid the unchecked range if we could.
Looking at
And
the
just change
current
behavior.
implementation, where it takes an int start and an int count, I don't buy the counter argument to 2 of change count to be a T, because right now if you start at int.min value, you can't walk through all the ints. It'll only catch up to 0. Actually, I think it'll only catch up to -1, but
Right. Yeah, you can only use int.max value for a count.
right, and int.max value plus int.min value is, I think, -1.
Right.
So the scenario of, I want to use sbyte.range and I want to start at the minimum sbyte, and I can only get up to -1, I have to then .concat 0. I guess you don't need to concat 0, you would just concat then the range of 0
It's
up
just,
through max
my
value.
point was it's changing from int count to int t, to t count rather.
Yeah.
Reduces what was expressible from what we had previously approved.
For small numbers, and
Yes.
it expands it for numbers bigger than int.
Correct.
But I'm saying since the int already has that problem, I don't think it's I think that's the
Yes.
most elegant fix. Is make it behave
Also,
exactly the way the
like-
int one does.
Sorry, you think the elegant fix is what, Jern?
T count.
T count.
It has the exact same limitations the int one does. And if we want something that doesn't have the limitations the int one does, that's when we make a new method group. Personally. Because I agree it's limited, but it's exactly the same limited that the int one is. So it has precedence.
Tanner, if we did, I I guess 3, but maybe it would apply to others. Would we change the constraint from I binary integer to, is it I increment operators or whatever that is?
Yeah, I increment operators would work.
Would we consider making this long instead of tier int? Like you mentioned that that's so big, you could never enumerate them all with any real hardware.
Actually, it couldn't just be I increment operators. I think it'd have to be I number base.
Oh, because of comparisons and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But there's a smaller set we could do, but I don't think we want to get into the complexities of anything that is comparable and incrementable, where you start having to consider all the weird edges with that.
Right. I guess what I was suggesting is we could expand this by reducing the constraint. We could allow floating point in here.
Yeah.
But yeah, would we consider long? Sorry if I cut into that question and answer.
I mean,
And I think sorry, I was just saying we wouldn't reduce the constraint for 2 because it'd be strange to have a count of 6.74.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Stefan. You were saying something.
Yeah. So I mean, we consider T and int, and maybe it's obvious, but like Tanner mentioned earlier, that like you could conceivably go through like 2 billion items. Not that hard, but like a long would give you as much as as many items as you could ever realistically handle, right?
right, but I thought that the problem was not being able to understand how to correctly relate count to t dot max.
Yeah, we would have the same problem with long.
Well, yeah, I guess I don't see that as the problem. Like I'm kind of with you. Like let it overflow. It's kind of convenient.
Oh yeah, no, I meant we would have the same overflow checking problem.
Right, and I guess I'm like,
No,
why not both? why not like, yeah, instead of making it T, I'm kind of taking the complete other side as Jeremy. Like I kind of see Jeremy's point of T has the same limitations with only being able to enumerate half the ints or half the, int 128s or whatever. But we could kind of improve it. Like, is it really going to be that big of a problem if it's slightly different behavior? The net framework, maybe.
I mean, to be clear, I'm more concerned about a difference in behavior between range of T and range, or range of int and range, I should say. I think those should be identical behaviors.
On the same platform, right? So
On
we
the same platform.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think it is still a concern, but less of a concern. I mean, we make exceptional conditions non-exceptional every release. So my concern here is just that this is a very prominent method. So, but we could choose to say it doesn't matter. That's fine.
I'm concerned it's too prominent to break. Because I agree, range and range of T should have the same.
If someone started writing code that would break, but doesn't undone at 10 plus, and then it breaks down level. That's what you mean.
I think that there's probably a non-trivial amount of people who are relying on the exception coming out of range to be there. Oh, I would have overflowed, and that if we remove it and it starts wrapping from int.max value to int.min value and continues, that there will be surprises, and so my concern is that the kinds of people who would call range are the kinds of people who can't handle that surprise.
What if we did it as just range unchecked, a new method group? We don't expose the generic one here, and we say that in order to support generics, this is what it's doing, this is the behavior. Have fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine to have new behavior in a method that doesn't match the name of the current method group.
So Tanner, your whole argument against TT, like even introducing it, is that it just has the same problem that it has today, basically, intent.
Yeah, there's a lot of the same problems. There's also the potential impact to native AOT and having two generic parameters in link and all the problems that come out from that.
Well, one generic parameter, right? Two normal parameters that are generic. Like, it's not TU. Like, is it really that bad to have two parameters that share the same generic type?
If you ever want to support other types in the future, it eventually has to become TU. Because if you want to support floating point ever, and we did get explicit asks for it, then you'd end up having T number and then T binary integer.
But that would be
But
an
couldn't those-
entirely different. That would be an entirely different API.
Method group, right? Yeah, I would hope. I would think.
I mean, there's no reason why a range API. Well, so like if we just had range unchecked and we had T start in count, that would work for any number type, including floating point.
Right.
Because we're changing the behavior and just saying it. We don't need to consider all the extra nuance.
Right.
Whereas if we're saying that we want T count, then we end up having to have the consideration of if we ever wanted that same method group to support floating point or other types in the future, we have to do that. And at that point, it seems worse to give people that one behavior when we could just provide one or two methods if we wanted to support long count as well and just cover all of it and say there's this one behavioral difference that's hopefully apparent from the name.
But you wouldn't need
So
the
I'm just trying to
TU.
understand where is the second. What are the two generic parameters that this range foo method would take?
So if you wanted to support floating point, you'd have to have a T start and then a T binary integer count.
No, you'd have a T start, a T max, and a T increment.
So you're talking about a create sequence API instead.
Sure. So we do create sequence instead of range. And then we
Also,
don't
you could
have to
support
care
floating
about
point with this
plus plus.
with int count. You could have just T start, and T is an I number base using an increment operator, and if you end up repeating, you end up repeating.
Right, but I thought we said that we didn't want the repeating behavior on the existing range API. Because
I
of
don't
the
know why.
concern of the break.
Because what would break?
Because of the concern of the breaking behavior. I thought that's what Jeremy said.
There's no
That's
no one
Jeremy's.
can do range today with floating point, so there's no
Oh,
breaking.
okay.
Yeah.
But then floating point would differ from the others.
Right.
Yeah, range
And you have the
of int
you
would
also have
differ
the
from range.
concern of int dot max value for T equals half becomes infinity.
I mean, for me, I guess maybe I'm oversimplifying, but for me, range, my mental model for range is the for loop that's written in number 3. So if I would expect that for whatever T is being used, that's the behavior I get. If it happened, if 16.8 million or whatever it is, or if float.max value plus plus produces float.max value, then that's the behavior I would have gotten if I'd written that for loop myself.
Right, and so that's why I think that's the better behavior as well. But I thought we had the concern of the existing range API having a behavior for int where it overflows.
Sure.
And so you wouldn't want to have it you wouldn't want it to do overflow checking for integers but not for floating point at that point.
Sure,
Because
but,
then that's still different behavior between
but I don't understand how a different overload that had a T number for count would fix that. It would still be an overload of range that just took a generic for the second count argument.
No, I'm saying that if we were to validate, then for floating point, you'd have to have two generic parameters because you can't have a T count that is float. You'd have to have it be a binary integer.
Or int.
Yes, or int.
Or long. But yeah, like if we're not approving the int version that overflows or the long version that overflows, I don't see the reason to then not approve the TT. Like I think we should do one or the other, right?
You're saying don't do one, do 2 or 3.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. Yep.
And what I was suggesting is we do one, but we say that instead we're exposing it as range unchecked. That way we can have the overflow behavior.
I just don't love range unchecked, I suppose. Like, I think we should just make a decision. Like, we either decide, like, to make that the default behavior, or people got to write it themselves if they want it to be unchecked, is kind of my feeling.
Okay, so it's 1, prove nothing. Then that's 2. That's 3. And this is, we've talked about it, but it's not in Steve's list, 4. Okay.
Yeah. And I would lean towards 3 at the moment, but I do see your point, Jeremy. Like, I can't confidently say that, like, no one's relying on the fact this won't overflow and that negative numbers won't cause weird failures. It is a pretty common API.
I would also lean towards 3, but if we do 3, we can't do it in .NET 10. It's too late to catch the breaking change if it exists.
It's too. Oh, I see. It's too late. Like to let people. You think people use our previews? No, I'm just kidding.
We have to do it early in .NET 11, I think.
All right.
And I think 4 would be my second choice because it could still be done in 10 and it avoids the ambiguity, and it could just be where T is number instead of binary integer.
And
I'm not
do we ever
concerned
get an
about.
answer?
Sorry, I was going to say I don't think we should make this choice based on schedule pressure. I think there's no urgent need to get this into 10.
Fair. But did we decide that like int's definitely better than long for 3 and 4? Or it's like, is there a reason that should be obvious to me?
There is an implementation detail that we could work around, but it's there, which is that and this, to some extent, this will also apply to 2, which is that the range implementation implements iList, so that if someone and various downstream implement, and it also implements the internal flow information between operators thing that has like a get count, and so like those are both int based, which means that for any T whose max value was larger than int, we would have to use a different implementation that did not implement those interfaces.
So we'll have to do that for 2 as well, to your point, or we'll have to do this for 2 no matter what. If we do 2,
we have to do it for 2 unless we know that T is int or smaller.
Right. Okay. I mean, it doesn't seem that bad just to make it a long and then check if it's smaller than an int. To me, but maybe it's not worth the like extra implementation.
I think you'd want 2 overloads just because of how implicit integer conversions and the cost of checks and everything else end up playing out. You'd want int and long as 2 separate overloads.
I see, at which point we could do that later too, for that matter. All right.
If let me throw out a last number 5, and I don't even know if this is a valid option. If we wanted to keep the existing behavior, Tanner, what would we need to add to generic math to allow us to do T plus int in a compliant way?
We'd have to. So there's no guarantee. There's no way to expose it that guarantees it will work in all scenarios, because some types always have checked behavior and some types never have checked behavior. Floating points, for example, never have checked behavior. They always saturate.
Mm-hmm.
And some types like decimal, they don't saturate. They don't allow you to wrap around. They always overflow, or they always throw an overflow exception. So there's nothing we could add to generic math to guarantee it would always work. We could, however, expose some kind of try add and try subtract and other APIs where the dim is basically do the operation in a try catch return a bool. That would make this more efficient and easier to read and maintain for typical scenarios where saturation doesn't occur.
Okay.
But I don't know that we could add that where it took a t and an int, because when it gets to int, the call would itself become ambiguous of did you want the int plus int from int, or did you want the t plus int from this other thing?
You would end up having to do a you'd end up doing a t try create, or you'd have to have some API that allows you to determine which of the t or the other has the broader range.
But the problem there would be if we wanted to support, like in the S-byte case, -128 plus 200.
Right.
That wouldn't work because you couldn't do t dot try create from 200 to S-byte.
Right. You'd end up having to figure out which is the larger of the two, and having a path that does, if u has a larger range than t, then try add that and then try and convert back. Otherwise, convert from int to the other. It's complicated when you start getting multiple t in where one's known and one's unknown.
Right. Okay. So sounds like we're saying it sounds like folks are leaning towards 3 in the future, but not now.
And is 3 as constrained as it needs? Like, could it be any less constrained? Like,
I think it could be number base.
I mean, it could be whatever exposes the concept of t.1 and plus. So.
Yeah, so number base or number, depending on if you want to support things like complex of t.
I mean, it would add the real part. It says it'll add 1.
Yeah. I mean, I so would we approve that, like, I number version of 3 for 11?
So, Mr. St. John, welcome to the meeting. You've worked on compat for a long time. How scared would you be about removing the overflow in enumerable.range?
Removing the overflow.
Sorry, removing
Right now,
the exception and letting it overflow.
Yeah, right now if you pass in int.max value as start and 4 as count, you'll get an argument exception. The proposal would be to remove that argument exception and just let it wrap around.
I see. I'd be less worried about that from a compat perspective of like breaking people. It would be like, does anybody rely on that for some sort of safety guarantee? Were they counting on us keeping them safe or secure by throwing there? That would be my worry. I don't think removing an exception we tend to think of that as like acceptable compat risk. It's not going to like crash someone or drastically change the behavior of the app, but giving them I wonder if there's a promise, any sort of security promise that would go away. Does that make sense?
Yo. Yeah, like I was like, that's the big fear, right? It's like one person relied this for security, and like if they got a negative number, they bypass some check. It just seems so unlikely. But in this case, right, it only takes one for like one bad case for it to be bad. But I don't know.
Yeah. What's the benefit we get from it? Is it perf or what?
A cleaner API.
Yeah,
All right, that doesn't feel like a good trade-off.
it's the ability to support more t. So right now today it only supports int and int count. it would allow you to have T be, for example, S byte, and then it can start at -127 and count all the way up to 128, because that's 255 space, and that's more than what S byte can represent by itself. Or
I see. I see.
Yeah.
I would go with a different name. I wouldn't. For me personally, it wouldn't be worth the risk of potentially giving someone different behavior that they were counting on in the base API. I'd say give it the new name, but that's
In which case, sorry. In which case, I vote 2 though. Like I like 3, but if that's where we are, like I actually don't like range unchecked. Like
I see.
2.
If you can overload it so that it wouldn't change the behavior for any existing source code, would 2 or 3 change the behavior for existing source code recompiled?
3 would, 2 wouldn't, 4 wouldn't. But then the question is between 2 and 4, I think.
Oh, so 3 is not even about recompilation. It's moved to the next version and surprise negative numbers.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the most.
Yeah, personally, 3 is my least favorite. But it's not a hill I'm gonna die on. So if everybody else likes it, then cool. It makes me uneasy.
We could do 2 and 4, I suppose. Like I just don't particularly like 4. I would rather not.
Just because of the name.
Yeah, and it's not that hard to write. It's just like whatever. At that point, just write it.
Yeah. If anyone has a better name suggestion.
No, it's just the name. Like, and it's not that there could be a better name. It's just like literally having a new method group at all for such a simple thing. It's just like,
They would have had to have specified inputs that would cause it to overflow, right? But I guess those could be known at runtime. Only known at runtime. Okay.
Well, we could, instead of calling it range unchecked, we could skip range entirely and call it enumerable sequence to match the create sequence API that we exposed on vector types, and people could just specify step of 1. And then we could solve the other thing people have been asking for at the same time without changing anything about range. It wouldn't be, you have to specify 1 extra parameter that is 1 in cases, but that's not really the worst. And then it's not a bad name.
that's a pretty good compromise. Yeah, like if we're gonna add a new method group, make it do something more interesting than just being unchecked. Like allow you to provide a step. That seems reasonable-ish. Or would it just be sequence? Like we didn't do create range.
People kept saying create sequence, so that's what I wrote down.
I see. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
sequence is fine.
Because sequence is the word that we converged on for the vector APIs that were exposed.
I like option 5, with maybe just with sequence instead of create sequence.
Yeah, it is pretty good. Now, if we did that, would we also do 2?
I don't think you need to. I mean, you could. Do we have a way with generic math of making T step optional and having it default to T.1?
You could make it nullable.
Yeah.
Or you could also have a sequence overload that is start end, and if there is none, it's implied to be 1.
Right. So that is a little weird that that's the same as range then, logically.
Yeah, because then it's like, why are these overloads of ranges?
Well, because
Or
this
range,
is an end
rather.
instead of a count.
Okay. that's
Because
actually a good
only
point.
it knows when it hits the end.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's fair.
Because instead of
And-
calling it
and-
with 4, you'd call it with, start plus 4.
The only question would be, is end inclusive or exclusive? I think we'd want to say inclusive.
Do we have
So-
any prior art?
So 0, 0 gives you 1 item.
I think so. because otherwise you can't create a sequence of the whole range.
Yeah. That's a good argument. All right, I'm. This is.
What? It's just out of curiosity, what would happen if I did start 0, end 0, step 0? Does that produce an infinite sequence?
It would break on the start equals end, so it would yield. But start 0, end 1, step 0 would probably
Produce
melt
an
your CPU.
Yeah, I think we'd have to have it so in order to support a full range for T, I think we'd end up having to do tracking that says start, when start equals end, break out of the loop, and then return,
But not before.
Yeah, but not before, and then you have to return end once after, and then you're done. So it basically ends up being that way you also handle wraparound.
What if start is greater than end, nothing is returned?
You'd still end up wanting to support backwards increment. So you could have start equals 5, end equals 1, step equals -1.
I guess I'm trying to understand what the loop looks like. So is it
I think you'd basically write it as while start does not equal end, then loop adjusting start by the increment amount.
that means
and
if start was 0, end was 1, and step was 0.7, it would loop around like the full float space?
Yes. But technically it would end up hitting an infinite loop, but yes.
Once it got to infinity or something.
Well,
it just
no.
sat there.
That feels wrong. If I have start of 0, like if T is int and start is 0, end is 100, and step is 3, I feel like I would be very surprised if that became an almost infinite loop.
I mean,
We
even
could-
better, make it be unsigned, start at 0, end at 1, step of 2. It'll literally run forever.
Right.
But like, I would assume that this would allow me to do things like, yield all multiples of 3 between 0 and 100.
You could end up saying that the stepping has to be negative if start is less than, or if start is greater than end, and throw otherwise, which would solve your concern.
Jeremy's concern.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah,
But
if step is not relatively prime to delta, then unless you do a check of if my current is greater than or equal to end, I guess you'd care about differently than equal.
I don't think we can have this do an exact check between start and end. That feels really wrong to me.
Yeah, it seems too easy to mess up.
I think it would need. I think everyone would expect it to be. Don't give me a answer bigger than end unless we want to support the arguments being backwards for step down.
Yeah, I think people would expect we're doing like less than, greater than comparisons. I think that's
In
fair.
which case, we would basically say, if start is less than end, then step must be positive. If start is greater than end, then step must be negative.
I think so. Yeah, it would be an argument exception.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
And
unless
Either step can never be 0, or we say fine, if start equals end, then step can be 0 because we don't care. But
so does that mean it can't overflow? This is basically what we're saying. It's consistent with range.
Yep, it wouldn't be able to overflow.
It's funny we got all the way back there. We were trying to come up with an API that could overflow. It's like, nope.
You just have to define your own T that defines greater than in a way that you know when it needs to stop. So
Oh, we'd also then need to check that start and end and step are finite, and there's still the issue with floating point in that you can end up with something that saturates to a point that it no longer changes the value and it is infinite. So
We'd
floating
also-
point always has an infinite
Yeah.
enumeration chance.
I see your point about saturating versus infinity. Like the increment won't do anything. Yeah.
We'd also need to check if we didn't want. We'd also need to check that if in going past end you also overflowed, that we would need to stop and not just have it be a comparison between the current value and end.
Right. And all of these cases are handleable. We can do things like say terminate if the sequence returns the same value twice. We could say terminate if the sequence overflows. Or throw in that case. We just couldn't necessarily eagerly exit in those cases.
How do we do overflow checking reliably without exceptions?
You can't. That's why I was saying we can't do it eagerly.
Yeah, but even not eagerly, you just like as part of iterating, I add step to my current value, and if I go past end, even if that overflows, I want to end the sequence.
Right. So the typical way you'd have to do that is you'd end up having to say either is start is the new value less than the one of the inputs, in which case you overflowed past into the negative realm, or you've computed the same value as the input, in which case that you're saturating.
I mean, you could avoid the overflow by just saying end is the min of end and max minus step. You now literally can't step past it and jump over the end. It doesn't solve the floating problem, but it solves it for integers.
I didn't follow that, Jeremy.
So if you're stepping by 1,000,000,
Yeah.
You say end is the lesser of int.max value minus 1,000,000, or the end that you asked for. If you now will have already stopped as soon as you're within the range of 1,000,000 toward the end or toward max value, then you're not going to add another 1,000,000. So even if they
But
said,
how do I tell what value to yield or not?
because it's functionally equivalent. End is t dot n of end and t dot max value minus step inside the implementation.
You're saying at the beginning before I start looping.
Yeah, before you start looping, drop end to the maximum legal value it could have had.
Which then excludes big integer.
Big integer won't overflow.
Big
Right,
integer
but
doesn't have a max value.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, fair enough. All this, yeah. Now you get the runtime. Like, I need to care. Are you? I have max value.
No, you can't even do that. It has to. We couldn't. You either have to put whatever the interface is in the constraint or not, and that would impact whether big integer could be used.
Fair enough.
The only
Stupid
thing you really
non-finite
can
numbers.
do here is effectively the equivalent of a triad, where for wraparound behavior that is start plus current value plus increment is less than current value if you're incrementing positively, and otherwise it's greater than if you're doing it negatively, and otherwise result equals current value would also indicate that you have saturated. So without an explicit triad method, that is how you detect either overflow or saturation.
And then you special case, or you just disallow step equals 0.
Yeah, if we want to disallow infinite sequences, we would end up saying that step cannot be 0, and we have an API to check for that on iNumber.
Yeah, I mean, somebody can implement their own. They can claim to be a binary integer and choose to do addition in a way that just melts your CPU. But
That's up to them now.
Yeah.
Violation of the contract is
right, conforming numbers would have a is 0. That is well behaved.
I have to ask, is this API and the complications it adds significantly better than the 2-line for loop?
Sometimes I think it can be when writing in like a notebook or something. Like having easy ways to initialize sequences.
Sounds like
I think the complexities are coming from us trying to make it more advanced than the for loop. And I think that simply an API that works like the for loop, where it's basically start end step, with the benefits that it can integrate with Link cleanly, in that we can do special optimizations that no one else can do because we don't expose those internal interfaces for users to implement themselves, is fine. And someone, either us or errorprone.net or someone else, will write an analyzer to help catch common mistakes for infinite enumerations, as will, basic testing.
I mean, the basic the for loop that I think 99% of people would write is I equals start, well, I is less than end, I plus equals step.
Right.
Which is an exclusive end.
Sure.
So someone pointed out in the YouTube chat, like I don't use that vector.create sequence is like t start t step, and I guess doesn't take an end. And
yeah.
But one thing I was curious is, like, would we create an API that produces an infinite sequence? Like, could it just be like t start t step is the first overload and it produces,
and then you just break out when you're done?
Maybe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty common in like functional programming languages. I don't know how, that are lazy or do, but it makes sense. Like IEnumerable is the lazy data structure, right? So
yeah, I mean, vector sequence doesn't need it because vector is a finite size, so you get however many you fit with a count of the size you picked divided by the size of t.
Yeah, there's never a consideration of infinite enumeration or anything like that.
But
right, yeah, I get that it's not conceptually the same, but for IEnumerable, like you could imagine something without an end. I think that makes sense for IEnumerable. And like I was thinking, like you were saying, is it worth it, Steven? And I'm like, man, I totally would have used something with a start and a step or whatever. But yeah, I would think like in some cases I wouldn't even necessarily want it to end, because I might want to programmatically break out, to your point.
I mean, we could certainly do a sequence of start and step, and if you care to bound it, you either check the value yourself or call .count, or sorry, .take. But woe betide the person who calls sequence of start, comma, step, .take last.
Well, we could do it as start step, and then you could have end be the last parameter, which would also give flexibility for that being like a predicate t, so that the user could say, I want to terminate on this t, or there's flexibility there if you make step the second.
But in that case, you might want to put like infinite or something in the name, since it's probably a little bit unusual in C# to. So maybe it's fine to require the end for this API. I was just thinking along the lines of, is it worth it?
So we have 3 minutes left in scheduled time. There's a little bit of amusement, I think, from a question Mr. Tobe asked, which is, are we ever going to make up in the forward history or the forward future of the universe? Are we ever going to make up for the time we've spent on debating this? And that is, which bucket do we want to pick in? We shouldn't keep shaping 5 if it's not what we want. If we like 5, then certainly we can finish it. But if we're actually leaning towards something else, then we should talk about 5 when it gets proposed.
I think 5 is the best compromise between all of them, and covers the other ask that people have been needing. And I think allowing infinite sequences is fine, and people will end up having an analyzer eventually to help flag when they accidentally write a bad case, and that likely won't be super common.
Yeah. And I do think this makes it way more useful. Like, for power users who want to create their infinite sequence break out of their loops or various things.
Okay, so we think we want a sequence of start step and then an optional, meaning overloaded end.
And if you don't pass that, then it would overflow if the integer thing is overflowable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming we're saying if it's start step, it's an infinite sequence.
Yeah, I think so. That makes sense to me.
It just says while true, yield return
Increment.
cur plus equals step. I guess yield return cur plus equals step. There you go.
Yeah, I also like 5. Let's make the time we spent on this worth it. I think people will like it, and we could potentially even do it in 10, right? Since we're not breaking anything.
So do we even want the limited one, or do we just always want to make people cap themselves?
I would take.
I think you need the limited one.
Okay.
Yeah, I think more people will end up using the limited one. I think the top one is more of a convenience thing if you want to customize the behavior without requiring a predicate input and all the overhead of that.
Okay.
I don't love that start, step, end are out of order with how you would write this in a for loop or how it shows up in range effectively. It's not exactly the same, but
We can
but I
solve.
don't have a better option without changing the meaning of a parameter when you add the third thing, if we care about having the infinite sequence.
I mean, we could call it sequence start and step, and infinite sequence of start step.
We could. Honestly, I don't mind that.
Yeah.
And then would we have all the checks that we were talking about on the non-infinite sequence to make sure that it's indeed non-infinite?
I think you would have to.
Yeah. Okay, that seems fine. It's very clear. Still convenient. I would take it over the for loop. And you can imagine combining infinite sequence with like a break or a take while or whatever.
Okay. Do we like the names start, end, and step? I don't know if we have any other things that use step versus increment versus potato.
That vector API, did it use step?
Yeah, we used step for the vector API.
And start. So there we go.
And then we can just dock if end is inclusive or exclusive, or we can add more optional things. Do we know what the constraints on this are? Is this just I number base? Are all numbers additive?
Yeah, it'd be I number base, or no, sorry, it'd be for infinite sequence, it can be I number base. For sequence, we would want I number.
For infinite sequence, it can't just be I add, or whatever that is.
Well, yeah, it could actually be just I addition operators for infinite sequence because we never have to compare.
Nice. Good catch. Is that a change that if we notice later we could do in like a non-breaking way, like
We can
relax the constraint?
We can relax. We can't make it more constrained.
Yeah.
So sequence could become less constrained in the future. Infinite sequence could not.
Sequence could be I number base.
It can't because you need to be able to compare, and complex numbers aren't comparable.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize we didn't have comparisons on I number base.
Yeah, it's specifically because complex numbers aren't comparable.
It is basically the difference between I number and I number base.
Yep.
Plus apparently modulus.
So no complex sequences for us. All right, this still seems nice. I like it.
Sequence or infinite sequence versus sequence infinite.
Infinite sequence sounds more natural. I don't mind it because I think infinite is pretty specialized and like people doing enumerable. Like, I think it's actually really nice to start with infinite. Like I looked for this method on enumerable in the past. I know, because it feels like it should be there. So
And
I don't know.
IntelliSense and any kind of doc search for sequence will end up showing both of them.
Would we add other infinite things in the future, like infinite repeat?
Maybe.
Wouldn't repeat just be the same as start with step of 0?
Not if you want anything other than additive numbers. I want to repeat a string.
Oh yeah. No, that seems reasonable to have infinite.
I'm not saying we add it now. I'm just trying to understand, like, would we use the infinite prefix on other things?
I think we would, if we had this for sure.
If we had reasons to. Yeah.
Like, but yeah, given that we already shipped infinite sequence and we want to do the same thing for repeat, like, I think we stick with that convention. I think it's reasonable.
Yeah, again, I'm just thinking through, like, just from a naming perspective, would we want to group by sequence, in which case it would be a suffix of infinite, or would we want to group by infinite and group all the infinite things together? But now that IntelliSense does show you based on substrings, I'm not sure it really matters.
Yeah.
It flows more naturally as a prefix, I think, here, and it's special enough. I think it's fine with it not being grouped.
Yeah, that's my feeling as well. Like, I see your point about grouping the sequences and the repeats together, but yeah, I agree with Tanner. Infinite prefix is fine.
All right, and yeah. So is end the right parameter name for end? I think it is. I just don't know if we have
start and end are like opposites. I think pretty.
I don't know if
commonly
we
in
have
APIs.
start
Unless
end
we
things
wanted-
elsewhere, and it's called start last or start max or.
Unless we wanted to call it like end inclusive or end exclusive to be very explicit about what it was.
Ooh, actually, I don't mind putting inclusive in there.
Or inclusive end or whatever.
Yeah.
And then start inclusive. No, I'm just kidding. I think most people know.
Okay.
Ship it.
End
I think.
inclusive or inclusive end?
And inclusive.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Inclusive end flows better, but I think whenever I think about it, I think of end, comma, inclusive.
Yeah, I think of it usually in terms of parentheses. So.
Are there
Basically
any
the
use
exact
cases
opposite
for
of- Oh, sorry.
are there any use cases for step being some other type? TR.
We would have to
Um,
then convert the step to the type to be added.
Yeah.
Well, it could be I addition operator TRT, something.
I don't think any of
Nothing.
our types implement that.
Yeah, none of our types actually implement that in practice. It's so the reason I addition operators takes all 3T is to support cases like vector plus scalar. But in practice, that's not something that normal number types support, which is why iNumber itself only takes a single T. So I don't think we'd want anything but it to be T-step here and force users to specify the type and consider the conversion themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely unreasonable, right? To have infinite sequence return a sequence of vectors that are offset by a scalar or something like that, right? If it has that operation, but it does.
But we couldn't
require
even
two-
like if someone passed in long start in step, it wouldn't work.
Right.
Like it would fail to compile.
Yeah, and I think having two generic parameters is probably more confusing than it's worth, even if it could sometimes make sense.
Chat says F# already has these, and asks how they did it.
That's true. F# does already have these.
So are they specifically referring to the F# sequences of the like 0.10 step
Right.
amount? Or
They have syntax.
No,
Yeah,
it's-
exactly.
it's start ... step end, I think, is how it works there.
That's true.
And is end inclusive
So,
or
like-
exclusive?
There's the F sharp. Including the endpoint.
Yeah, it's inclusive, thankfully.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's an argument for making step the middle if we want it to be consistent with that F sharp syntax. But I think we're in C sharp, so making it consistent with the for loop is fine.
It says
Yeah,
they
I
also have
think
a function instead of just the syntax. I don't know what
Yeah.
it is.
Python's range is start, stop, step.
Yeah.
Inclusive. Or no, theirs is exclusive.
So we've copied no one. We're original. Yeah.
Actually, I'm not sure if it's inclusive or exclusive based on the sample because they have a sample that goes 1 incrementing by 2 stop 10, and so it stops at 9 instead.
Gotta love taking the easy way out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if Python's inclusive or exclusive by default, but they do start, stop, step.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and I assume that F sharp is they had the start step, and then somebody wanted to add a stop, and they're like, but adding that in the middle's complicated, so we have to add it on the end.
They
Well-
copied their thing from OCaml and stuff. I'm
Fair
pretty
enough.
sure that they started with the initial range, like 0.10, and then added step in the middle later. But like, it's hard to know. But yeah, it's fine.
Is inclusive the most natural here? Like if it was a for loop, wouldn't we expect it to be exclusive? Like you start with 0 and then you go to array not length or something.
That's why we
Or-
call it out.
Yeah, the confusing part though is because you're not so for loops kind of work because typically when you're doing like length, you're almost doing a count. And so in a typical for a loop, you're saying start at 0 and then increment up to the number of elements, which is a count. If you're writing a for loop that's not 0 based and you're trying to hit an upper limit, especially if that upper limit could be max value, it has to be inclusive. And you have to consider the nuance there. So like if you just wanted to have a sequence of all 32-bit integers, then you need to have the end be inclusive to be able to enumerate them all.
And Python can be exclusive, which makes it similar to their loops because they don't have overflowing numbers, as far as I understand. Everything's bigger. Or just, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, some of our things do take end as exclusive, like the give me a random number in a range, and that's because we expect it's being used as an array index, which means you want it as the lowest value that's not allowed instead of the largest value that is allowed. But that means that we can't ever have the random get int API doesn't support give me back max int because it can't.
Which is also unfortunate in some cases.
Yeah, I think we made a 0 arg one that can.
Yeah.
But okay.
Well, there's a lot of ways to design this. I think this is a good one. There are other ways, though, but
Yeah.
I'm glad we're doing it.
All right. Any objections? Once, twice. Sold with option 5, sidestep the problem. All right. Well, sorry we dragged some ARM people in and didn't get to the ARM APIs. Somehow the two things that felt like they were going to be 10 minutes each were an hour each. So, next time. Yeah. So, thanks, chat. There wasn't a lot to be said for the first issue, but definitely a lot of participation in the second. And hope you're happy with where we landed. If not, you can complain on the issue. And With that, we'll see you next week. Same .NET time, same .NET channel. And until then, ciao.